Let's be honest, most Unreal Engine render tutorials are still using old settings, random console commands, or stuff that doesn't even affect the final render. So today, we're fixing all of that. This is the Unreal Engine 5.8 Movie Render Queue and Movie Render Graph Guide, and I'm going to show you the settings that actually matter, what they do, and how to get cleaner, sharper, and more consistent renders. We'll start with Movie Render Queue, go through all the important settings, and then move over to Movie Render Graph and build a proper render setup from scratch. While this video isn't sponsored, I do want to let you know that there's currently a Summer Sonic sale going on at Liati's studio. You can get 48 premium packs worth $8,791 for just $39. Just make sure you use the SS80 discount code before checking out. The link is in the video description. Let's get started by opening the sequencer and then click on this video icon button to open this window. If you're seeing a different window here, make sure the Movie Render Queue plugin is enabled. Now, unlike before, we can't open the render config directly from here. So click on this drop-down and select Legacy Preset. And here we have our legacy settings. First, I'm going to remove the JPG sequence because we'll be using an EXR sequence instead, which is the industry standard for high-quality renders. And here, the compression is set to PIZ by default, but I'm going to change it to DWAB. Stands for DreamWorks Animation B, and there's also DWAA, which is the A variant. The main difference between them is the block size they use for compression. DWAA uses 32 scan lines per block, while DWAB uses 256, which makes DWAB a better choice for our EXR sequence here. Now let's add the anti-aliasing setting. Once that's added, we'll add game overrides, and then we'll add console variables as well. And we also need color output. Finally, let's add camera as well. And then we have all the settings we need for our render configuration. And in the camera settings, let's change shutter timing from frame center to frame open. This shifts the motion blur to the movement happening after each frame, which gives us a more natural result when rendering animated or moving shots. Next, let's switch over to anti-aliasing. For the temporal sample count, I'm going to set it to 16. If your render still looks like there's no motion blur, you can instead set the spatial sample count to 16 and leave temporal sample count at 1. And if you see this error message below, just enable override anti-aliasing, and the warning will disappear. I initially set both spatial sample count and temporal sample count to 8, but I'm going to switch them back to 1 and 16. Mixing both types of samples can work well in some cases, but for most renders, it's better to choose the sample type based on what you're trying to achieve. Next, enable Use Camera Cut for warm-up, then set the warm-up count to 64. We're done with the anti-aliasing settings, so let's move on to color output. Here, enable Disable Tone Curve. This removes Unreal's tone curve from the output and lets our EXR retain the original linear HDR values, which gives us more control when we do the color grading later. And now for game overrides, I won't change anything here. These settings are mainly used to override things like game mode, cinematic quality, texture streaming, and LOD settings during the render. But for our setup, the defaults are already fine. Next, let's move on to console variables. Here, I'm only going to add one variable, which is r.screen%, and I'll set the value to 150. Now that all the settings are done, we just need to set the output directory and resolution. By default, Unreal uses 1920 by 1080, but for a sharper render, I prefer using 3840 by 2160. Everything else looks good, and if you want to save these settings for future renders, just click on the Unsaved Config button and save it as a preset. That way, you can reuse the same settings without setting everything up again. Here's the preset I used to render the scene you saw in the video intro. Just for transparency, I'll load the preset here so you can see that it's the exact same one I used for that render. You can see high resolution here, but with tile count set to 1, it doesn't really give us any benefit. This setting is mainly useful when you're using multiple tiles to render larger resolutions. That is why I left it out of this preset. All the other settings are the same. Now let's click Accept, and once we're back in the render queue, you can render your animation by clicking Render Local. The Render Local button has been moved from the bottom to the top in the newer version. And if you want to switch to a remote render, just click on these 3 dots and select Remote. That's all you need to do. And now let's move on to the Movie Render Graph. Now click on the drop-down again, and this time select Movie Render Graph. Now double-click here to open the graph. And here we already have a bunch of nodes set up for us. For example, here we have the warm-up settings, global game overrides, and global output settings, where we can set things like the output directory and render resolution. We also have render layer, JPG sequence, and deferred renderer. First, I'm going to remove the JPG sequence, since we'll be using an EXR sequence instead. Once you've added the EXR sequence, make sure to connect its output pin to the render layer node so the graph is connected properly and everything works as expected. Now in the render layer settings, disable layer name because we're not using separate render layers for this setup. Now select the EXR sequence node again and change the compression from PIZ to DWAB, just like we did earlier. One thing to keep in mind is that DWAB can produce much larger files. So if you're short on storage, I recommend using DWAA instead. Next, let's move on to the warm-up settings. And the default values are fine here. After that, we have the deferred renderer settings. This is where we can change the spatial sample count, and I'll leave it at 1 for now. You may notice that the temporal sample count is missing here, but don't worry, we'll add that in a moment. Before that, let's disable the tone curve since we're not using ACEs for this render. And we can also change the anti-aliasing method here, but I always leave this set to none, so I'll keep it the same here. So now we need the temporal sample count for our render, and for that, let's search for a node called sampling method. And now you can see the temporal sample count here. First, I'll just align this node with the rest of the graph to keep everything nice and organized. Then set the temporal sample count to 16. You can increase this value if your render still looks noisy, or the motion blur needs more samples to look clean. And next, let's move on to the global output settings. First, I'll set the output directory, and then we can change the render resolution as well. I'll go with 4K here, since that's what I prefer to use for most of my renders. Next, enable zero pad frame numbers and leave it at 4. This makes every frame number use 4 digits, like 0001, 0002, or 1125, which keeps the image sequence properly organized, even if we have over 1,000 frames. If you're wondering why we didn't enable this in Movie Render Queue, it's because zero pad frame numbers is already enabled by default there. And with that, all the main settings are done. The only thing we're missing is the camera settings we used earlier in Movie Render Queue. To use the same settings here, right-click in the graph and search for camera settings. Once you've added it, connect the input and output pins with sampling method and warm-up nodes. Then, under shutter timing, change frame center to frame open. These are the main settings we need to change for a high-quality render. One last thing we can do is adjust the file name format. Now select the EXR sequence node, and here you'll find File Name Format. Enable it so we can customize the file names for our rendered frames. By default, it includes the layer name, but we're not using render layers, so I'll remove that. I'll also change the sequence name to camera name. This way, the camera name will be included in the file name, which makes it much easier to check whether all of our cameras have been rendered. And if you want to use OCIO color management, for example ACEs, you can enable it here and set up your color configuration. But since we disabled the tone curve to have complete control over the color grading later, let's stick with that setup for now. I usually don't speak extra in my videos because I like to keep them short, informative, and focused. But I do want to take a moment to thank everyone who has subscribed to the channel. We're almost at 23,000 subscribers, and I really appreciate everyone who has supported me, whether that's by subscribing, donating through Ko-fi, or even picking up one of the sale bundles through my links. I do earn a small commission from those purchases, and it genuinely helps me cover my bills, other expenses, and upgrade my setup so I can keep making better content. I really, really hope you have an extraordinary day, stay healthy, and keep creating good stuff. Now back to the video. So now let's save this graph as a preset. Go to File, then select Save As. Here, give your preset a name. I'm going to call mine 4K_graph and then click Save. And now, if I go back to the Movie Render Queue window and open the drop-down, then select Movie Render Graph, you'll see our saved preset here. We can use this preset anytime we need to render, and we can even reuse it across different projects in Unreal Engine 5.8. And once you're ready to render, just click the Render Local button. And lastly, if you open the link from the video description to check out the bundle, when you're here, just click on I want this. On the next page, scroll down to the bottom and make sure the discount code has been applied before checking out. It's already applied here, but if it isn't, just enter SS80 and click Apply. The price should drop to $39.99, and then you can go ahead and check out. The bundle is available for both Unreal Engine and Unity.